All right, jumping right in today, we're diving deep into Kenyan news. Got a whole bunch of articles from October 6th, hot off the press. Kenyans.co.ke, Taifa Leo, Capital FM, Business Daily, the works. And let me tell you, it's a wild ride.
Quite the mix, isn't it? Really captures the dynamism of Kenya. And that's what we're here for, right? To unpack these stories, not just what happened, but what it all means for politics, for society, for everyday Kenyans.
Exactly. So let's start with what this Gachagua situation's gotten pretty intense. Capital FM had this piece. Gachagua's publicly asking for forgiveness.
Right.
From Ruto, from Parliament, the whole shebang. Because, the National Assembly is actually reviewing that impeachment motion against him right now.
Right. And that's not something to take lightly. People hear impeachment and they think it's a done deal. But in Kenya, you need a 2/3 majority vote in the National Assembly to actually remove a deputy president. So Gachagua was definitely feeling the heat, hence the whole plea for forgiveness.
Yeah, and he's not exactly going down quietly either. Kenyans, DACO.K, picked up on his claims that some MPs, members of parliament, were actually bribed to support the motion. Can you believe that? And then there's Taifa Leo reporting allegations of MPs being pressured, straight up intimidated. Makes you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes.
It's a tangled web, no doubt. And if these allegations hold any water, it could have serious legal consequences down the line. We're not just talking about the impeachment itself, but the whole integrity of the process.
Talk about high stakes. But then it gets even more interesting. Capital FM also mentioned Gachagua attended this, like, special church service. And not just any church, the National Prayer Altar, the one Ruto had built. Now that's a strategic move if I've ever seen one. Remember, that altar became quite symbolic for Ruto, especially during his own political battles. It's like Gachagua is tapping into that same narrative, maybe hoping to evoke a similar sentiment of resilience.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to send a message, hey, I'm facing challenges too, just like Ruto did.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Taifa Leo reported really low turnout at those public feedback sessions on the impeachment. You'd think people would be lining up to share their thoughts, but it seems like makes you wonder if those sessions were truly representative of the public's views. Were they accessible to everyone? Was there enough awareness? Or is it something else entirely? Apathy, maybe? Disillusionment with the whole political scene? It's hard to say for sure.
It's definitely a head-scratcher. But speaking of things that make you think, let's talk about this whole religious freedom debate. Ruto came out pretty strong, Capital FM covered it, saying he's not about regulating religious activities. He's all for freedom of worship, saying reform should come from the religious institutions themselves, not the government.
Right, but that's just one side of the coin, isn't it? We have to consider the proposed religious organizations bill. Kenyans.co.ke had the details on that one. And it's got some pretty hefty fines for unregistered religious institutions. 5 million shillings. That's a serious chunk of change. Clearly, the government's trying to send a message.
Yeah, and you can't talk about this without mentioning the Shakahola tragedy. Yeah. That really cast a dark shadow over everything, exposed some serious vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. It was a wake-up call, no doubt about it. Suddenly, the potential for abuse within religious groups was impossible to ignore. Kenya's always had strong protections for religious freedom, but Shakahola made it painfully clear that those freedoms can be twisted.
Exactly. And now the government's walking this tightrope, trying to prevent another Shakahola without overstepping their bounds.
It's a delicate balance, right? On one hand, freedom of religion is paramount. It's a fundamental right. But on the other hand, the state has a duty to protect its citizens, even from potentially harmful practices carried out in the name of religion.
And it's not just a Kenyan problem, is it? This whole debate about religious freedom, it's global.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the controversies around religious attire in Europe or the debates about certain practices in North America. It's a complex issue, no easy answers. We'll have to see how this bill plays out in Kenya, what kind of precedent it sets.
Yeah, definitely want to keep an eye on, for sure. Now, switching gears a bit, let's talk about the economy, specifically trade. Business Daily had a couple of articles that caught my attention. One was about Kenya's exports to other African countries. Seems they're slowing down. And then there was this whole thing about the government wanting to sell off 5 state-owned hotels. At first glance, they seem kind of unrelated, but I have a feeling they're connected somehow.
Right.
It's like, what's the bigger picture here?
Well, with the exports, it's likely a combination of things. Business Daily talked about those rising production costs we discussed last week. That's got to be hurting Kenyan businesses trying to compete. Plus, who knows what's happening with the economies of some of their trading partners, right? If those are shaky, demand's going to drop. It's just natural.
Makes sense. So it's not just about what's happening inside Kenya, but also the whole regional picture.
Exactly. It's all connected. And yeah, it makes you think, what happens to the people who rely on those exports for their livelihoods?
For sure.
Oh.
Okay, so then what about these hotels? Why sell them off now?
Privatization.
No,
It's
no.
always a bit of a gamble, isn't it? The hope is to attract foreign investment, maybe improve how those hotels are run, hopefully give tourism a boost. But of course, there are always concerns like, will these new owners be accountable? Will they keep employing Kenyans?
Yeah, it's a trade-off for sure. Hopefully it works out for the best.
We'll have to wait and see who ends up buying them, what their plans are. That'll tell us a lot.
Definitely something to keep our eyes peeled for. All right, but before we wrap up, gotta squeeze in one of those only in Kenya stories.
Oh, you mean the bus that took a dip in the Indian Ocean? Classic.
Had to, right? Kenyans.co.k had the scoop happened at the Likoni ferry, no less. Thankfully, everyone's okay. But man, that ferry seems to make the news a lot, doesn't it?
Well, it's a lifeline for so many people, but yeah, it's had its fair share of hiccups over the years. It just highlights how important good infrastructure is, right?
For sure, for sure. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about Gachagua fighting to save his own political skin, the debate raging over religious freedom, and even dove into the ups and downs of the Kenyan economy.
It's a snapshot of a country constantly evolving, always on the move.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to follow, right? So to our listeners, we leave you with this. What stood out to you today? What got you thinking? Hold on to those thoughts, because as we've seen, in Kenya, anything is possible.
Oh.
Until next time.